Hi everyone, my name is Liang Pengwei. Our group topic is about John Stuart Mill on liberty. The content can be divided into 5 parts: introduction, main argument, how to evaluate this argument, and do you agree with harm principle and learning application. John Stuart Mill was an English philosopher, one of the most influential thinkers in the history of classical liberalism. He contributed widely to social theory, political theory, and political economy, dubbed the most influential English-speaking philosopher of the 19th century. He conceived of liberty as justifying the freedom of the individual in opposition to unlimited state and social control. Views on liberty addresses the nature and limits of the power that can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. However, Mill is clear that his concern for liberty does not extend to all individuals and all societies. He states that despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians. John Mill is a representative figure in the development of Western liberalism. His thought not only inherited the essence of traditional liberalism, but also initiated the study of modern liberalism, so his thought has an important position. Liberalism has a deep historical origin in the West, which can be traced back to ancient Greece. Freedom has always been the goal of humankind's unlimited pursuit. Although many scholars have expounded on freedom before Mill, the content of the research is not comprehensive. It was not until Mill that systematically discussed freedom for the first time. As an outstanding representative in the development history of Western liberalism, he not only critically inherited traditional liberalism but also promoted traditional liberalism to modernity. A shift in liberalism, Mill's on freedom is a classical of epochal significance in the history of the development of Western liberal thought, and his exposition of the concept of freedom is also concentrated in his book, The Harm Principle. The harm principle holds that the actions of individuals should only be limited to prevent harm to other individuals. John Stuart Mill articulated this principle in On Liberty, where he argued that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. It was earlier stated in France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of 1789 as liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which accrue to the other members of a society the enjoyment of the same right. These limits can only be determined by law. The belief that no one should be forcibly prevented from acting in any way he chooses, provided his acts are not invasive of the free act of others, has become one of the basic principles of libertarian politics. The harm principle was first fully articulated by the English philosopher John Stuart Mill in the first chapter of On Liberty, where he argued that the object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle as entirely to govern absolutely the dealing of society with the individual in a way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. The principle is that the soul and for which man can are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection, that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civil community against his will is to prevent harm to others and his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He can't rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others, to do so would be wise or even right. The only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is able to society is that which concerns others. In the part which memory concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute over himself, over his own body and mind, and the individual is sovereign. Even if a self-regarding action results in harm to oneself, it is still beyond the sphere of justifiable state correction. Harm itself is not a non-moral concept. The implication of harm upon another person is what makes an action wrong. Harm can also result from a failure to meet an obligation. Morality generates obligation. Duty may be acted from a person in the same way as a debt, and it is part of the notion of duty that a person may be rightfully compelled to fulfill it.
Hello everyone, I'm Minghui. The part that I want to talk about what are the arguments provided by Mill to support harm principle. Mill's main argument for the harm principle consists of seven parts. First, the society's adoption of the harm principle can maximize social utility in the long run, more than any computing principles can do. Second, a socialized society should adopt the Hart principle. Third, the Hart principle optimally allows and promotes freedom of the speech. Fourth, the Hart principle optimally allows and promotes individuals' freedom to choose their own ways of beliefs. Fifth, the Hart principle optimally allows and promotes the complexity of the freedom of the choice. Six, the Hart principle optimally allows and encourages experiments of living. Seven, the Hart principle can effectively avoid the abuse of power by the government or the society. The question that Mills raises concerning Hart principle is the extent of the principle that citizens of a country should be granted. In response to the question, Mill comes up with some arguments which gives a very influential answer towards the same. According to Mill Harm's principle, individuals in a society should be granted freedom to do whatever they wish, provided their freedom does not harm other members in the society. Mill insists on that harm principle cannot be applied in all societies, but civilized ones alone. In the light of Mill's principle, harm refers to any damage that is not directed to a particular individual, or rather to the general public. Mill's argument is that the freedom of an individual can be restricted in the case where it can lead to injury to others, and also ensure that the institutional practice is not impaired. For example, tax evasion, drug smuggling can best be prevented by use the harm principle. Neil says, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any members of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient word over himself, over his own body and mind. The individual is the sovereign. By this, Will means that the freedom of an individual should not be limited by anyone. It, it is for their own sake and by no way affects others, provided an individual is not causing any harm to anyone. Their freedom should not be restricted by anyone, as it includes paternalism. Paternalism is the interference of a state or an individual with another person against their will, and defended or motivated by applying that the person interfered with will be better off protected from harm. The issue of law paternalism arises with respect to restriction by the law such as abstract legislation, the compulsory wearing of the statutes, and in medical contexts by the withholding of relevant information concerning a patient's condition by physicians, preventing people from doing what they want to themselves. Violence, paternalistic law, also prohibiting people from eating hotbed is violence harm principle. News harm principle argues that all the laws of the society should be attached to provide nourishment. Laws should be armed at protecting individuals from being injured by others, but not protecting providing nourishment. Confucianism does not agree with the harm principle, as it claims that the state should indicate its citizens to be moral. Harm principle, on the other hand, says that a state should just be neutral morally. Laws that discourage prostitution also violates harm principle. It says that if the society adopts the harm principle, can maximize social immunity, and no other principle can outdo it. If any society claims to violate, then it should adopt the harm principle. Neil's premise is supported by a number of evidences, which makes it easy to believe. For one, it promotes the freedom of speech. It also grants individuals right to choose the kind of life they want to live, or rather choice. It gives an opportunity to individuals to experiment life and prevents any government abuse of power. The freedom of speech is important for social unity, since it improves happiness in the society among others. Human beings are inherently liable and thus we should allow parenting views. Overwhelming cultural views can be harmful, and thus we should accommodate them. If individuals are given the right to choose, they will definitely choose what makes them happy, hence leading to maximal happiness in a society. Exercising freedom of choice would help a great deal in developing human nature. Any abuse of power by the government may lead to great suffering to individuals. That's how principle protects first-generation human rights. Some objection to human principle is that it is not clear on what is regarded to be harmful. It is also said choosing encouraging immoral behavior in a society, and thus it should be accepted in a society. To counter all these objections, her principle supports offensive principle. Harm principle discourages any acts that violate good manners in the public, or rather offend others.
Good afternoon, everyone, and now let's take a look at how to evaluate those arguments provided by Mill. There are many logical reasons to support Mill's arguments. Firstly, as my groupmates mentioned, the harm principle optimally allows and promotes freedom of speech. The reason is that rational debates and investigations flourish most in a free environment, and they are very important to the discovery of truth, the avoidance of errors, and the development of knowledge. Errors are often harmful and obstacle to progress. It's why we should avoid and correct errors. And the development of knowledge is often beneficial to the society. We human beings are fallible, even if our beliefs are true and the contrary views are false. Suppressing contrary views is still harmful. If we suppress the contrary view, and then we would miss the opportunity for our beliefs to be challenged. If we do not consider the challenge to our belief, then, however true it may be, if it is not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, it will be held as a dead dogma, not a living truth. And why Mill thought individual freedom to choose their own way of life is important. Because everyone's lifestyle is different. To a certain extent, people will definitely choose the lifestyles that make them happier. Therefore, if individuals have the freedom to choose their own way of life, it will be more conducive to the complete happiness of society than the state imposes a certain way of life on the individual. And Mill believed that the harm principle allows and promotes the capacity of freedom of choice. The exercise of freedom of choice is essential to the overall development of human nature, which is one of the most unique people abilities. Developing these abilities is helpful for people's success in the world and for him to lead a fulfilling and self-fulfilling life. In addition, the harm principle allows and encourages experiments of living. Why are experiments of living important to social utility? Although human beings are not perfect, they should have their own different views. There are therefore different experiments should be conducted on life. This is why important for human progress, because through these experiments we can know which lifestyles are good, which ones are bad. We can observe and learn from those who perform these experiments. Apart from this, the harm principle can effectively avoid the abuse of power by the government or the society, the majority. History proves that abuse of power by the government will cause a lot of suffering to the victim. Even democracy cannot guarantee the power will not be abused. There is a tyranny of the majority, like Hitler's Germany. Therefore, we can conclude that Mill's first main arguments can be established, but there have debate on arguments for utilitarianism. If societies adopt the harm principle to maximize social utility in the long run, more than any competitive principle can do, then society should adopt the harm principle. There are many principles that are likely to maximize social utility, but they are not accepted by society, so perhaps some qualifications can be adapted to Mill's arguments. 1. If society's adoption of harm principle can maximize benefits for the whole society in the long run, more than any competing principle can do, and if society's adoption of harm principle will not lead to society's violation of the principle of justice or to the weakening of the protection of human rights, then the society should adopt harm principle. 2 steps is society adoption of harm principle can maximize benefits for the whole society in the long run, more than any competing principle can do. And third is adoption of harm principle will not lead to society's violation of principle of justice or to the weakening of the protection of basic human rights. So we can come to this result. A civilized society should adopt the harm principle. But there still has another point that we need to discuss. The harm principle gives people too much freedom, and sometimes people may be offended by others without harming them. But all in all, conclusion is that in many cases, Mill's harm principle can be used as a strong argument on the issue of how much freedom the state should give the citizens. But not all of these arguments are perfect. After all, there are many behaviors, and it will be a violation of the politicians to do so publicly.
Represented. Do you agree with harm principle? Yes, human beings have the right, in part or collectively, to interface with the freedom of the movement of any other element for the sole purpose of self-defense. He essentially divides people's animal behavior into two parts, the part that only concerns the individual and the part that will concern others. The responsibility only involves the part of other must be responsible for the society. His independence has absolute, where only he is concerned. Secondly, the tyranny of the majority in a democracy. For example, kidnapping of the will of the majority, the people who exercise power and people to whom power is directed are not always the same, nor is self-government a government in which every man governs himself. It is a government in which every man governs himself by all others. The will of the people is really only the will of the majority, and the people demand the oppressions of a part of the whole. That's the purpose of the state. In long run, the value of the state comes down to the value of the individual who make up. And more. In Mill's book, I agree most of the idea or key idea I say. And what I have some question about is such absolute independence is embodied in the absoluteness of the exercise of their right. But at the same time, what constrains our behavior is not only the law. Even the law is the bottom line in many times. The moralative is high requirement. For example, we'll take a utilitarian attitude towards such moral issue. Of course, what he means by utilitarian is that people are regarded as progressive beings and based on their preeminent interests. As I understand it, when you give up your seats to the increase of the interest without harming the interests of others, then give up. If you give up your seats just because it is morally required, but it is actually a loss. For example, you are not feeling well today, then there is no need to give up your seat. It is a good point of view, but on reflection, how much of an event is entirely true of the person involved? So, when we're talking about the parts that involve other people, applying the harm principle to practice raises the question of what constitutes harm to others as a consequence of our actions. Mill does not give a definitive answer here. However, some scholars ask the question, what exactly constitutes harm to others? Does improper education cause harm? Does great inequality of wealth and income cause hurt? In his theory, because the concept is not clear, these both problems are not clear, point out, and have perfect explanation. Therefore, in some treatises, the principle of neutrality is the main theory. In Mill's discussion of free trade, the essence of some trade is freedom, such as the forbidding of the importation of opium into China. What we can object to about such interventions is not that they infringe on the freedom of producer and seller, but they infringe on the freedom of purchaser. They thought that this so-called freedom of producer and seller does not cause the harm of buyers. Why should it not be interfered with? But Mill thought that the most effective ways to achieve good quality and low price was to give complete freedom to the producer and seller. Therefore, when Mill constructs his theory of freedom, it did not always run through the article, and he was based on the Newtonian principle. Therefore, there is a certain distance between the argument and its premise and conclusion. For this reason, Mill imposed his theory of utilitarianism and add progressive element to utilitarianism. In Mill's theory, there is a qualitative and quantitative differences between happiness and pleasure, but I don't think that is splendid. Especially in modern times, the harm principle is conflict with the utilitarianism. This conflict also runs through his book. Next, Another problem is that he doesn't think that a society passive defense can have the same terrible consequences as the active attack. When Locke spoke of religious freedom, he says that the power of church ends with the excommunication of dissidents, the idea that bad people and most diverse minority who did not interfere with the society should not be punished violently, but should be kept away. The problem is that when the church is the whole society, excommunication also means that the social exclusion, because excommunication means exclusion from the society. In the same way, if the majority of the society do not actively punish the dissident minority, but simply avoid them, for the minority, it is no different from the religious confiscations of the soul from going to the heaven after death. For example, if a black family moves into a white community, the white people will say nothing directly to the black family, although they can not directly express dislike. They can move, so the community becomes black community and again. Also, another case, by law, you cannot discriminate against the ethnic minorities. The dominant ethnic group obeying the law, but not using violence, but using the cold violence against it. Despite this problem, I still agree with his core theory. If a person's behavior does not harm the interests of others, it is his personal freedom, and it is the boundary between the society and the individual. The only question I raise is that, in his argument, I agree with his core point. And there is some drawback or some shortcoming that they cannot consider at the same time due to the cultural background or his history background. Within certain limit, the individual always have the personal freedom remaining dependence from interferences. That is because no matter how the times develop, Mills on liberty is still forward-looking and Mills liberalism will still have high value. So let's put the mic to my teammate. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Betty. I'm going to talk about some learning from the Milham's principle and some application can use in the social issues nowadays. First of all, the contemporary significance. Milham's principle determines the scope of freedom and the basis for its restrictions. Unless an individual's behavior constitutes harm to others, the society has no right to treat him by coercion, no matter legal punishment, moral condemnation, or social isolation is absolutely not allowed. When entering the 21st century, the degree of understanding of the value like justice, freedom, fairness is uneven, and the evaluation criteria tend to be diversified. So in such a state, it is also indispensable for the public to establish a sense of freedom and to make clear scope of the freedom. Then next is some application in tort liability law based on Milham's principle. Article 2 of the tort liability law stipulates anyone who infringes upon civil rights and interests shall bear tort liability in accordance with this law. Civil rights and interests include the right to life, the health, the right to name, reputation, honor, portrait, privacy, copyright, patent, equity, and inheritance. The scope of rights protected by law is defined, and the law immediately intervenes if the interests protected by this law are infringed upon. Then there are Also, some conditions not suitable for intervention, like in the economic field, Mill believes that economic activity is better dominated by sellers and buyers. It helps economy get real development. And the second is something needs personally appropriate, such as jury system, urban autonomy, better realization of personal consciousness. Then is using Mill's harm principle to guide people to better use the freedom of speech on the internet. First one is in the online speech environment, parties should not use their speeches to harm each other's interests. Anyone who makes use of the freedom of speech on the internet to spread information and ideas has obligations to safeguard and resist the interests of others and the collective from the measureless harm of speech. The third point is if a party's online speech does not cause direct and specific harm, but treat others' emotions, spiritual feelings, social public interests negatively, the public opinion can condemn the party who makes speech and it should not be used as a reason to impose power punishment on it. Then we can get some enlightenment nowadays from the Milham's principle. First of all, only by promoting the development of market economy can we realize the development of individual freedom. Political freedom is the foundation of the socialist democracy. Mill believes that society must not only tolerate but cultivate individual freedom of action, allow people to experiment with different ways of life, as long as it does not harm the rights of others, be more tolerant and understanding. The third point is legal are the guarantee of maintaining socialist social order. A sound and perfect legal system must be established. Historically, if freedom is separated from reasons and the rule of law, society will fall into chaos and politics will be turbulent. Individual freedom is a way to promote comprehensive development of people. Freedom not only means individual autonomy, choice, true coordinates with the relationship between the individual and society, also must rely on human knowledge, morality, and other internal qualities. Next is principle always has their limitation, like what is harm and how to understand the violation of the rights of others, because different countries and races will not have same understanding and understandings of moral norms. Every race is only judged by their own moral norms, sometimes may be wrong. Secondly, blurring the boundaries between the two fields, the distinction between an individual's actions and those involving others is more difficult because it's impossible to draw a definite line between the two. Next one is the conflict between individual freedom and the principle of parental love. There are examples like using drugs, riding a motorcycle without a helmet. So, therefore, whether the outside world should interfere with it as necessary. Finally, do some conclusion. Based on the above analysis, restate to Mill's harm principle in the range of a civilized society, in addition to minors, in addition to the harm to the other's interests, in addition to the activities of social intervention, will bring more damage. Examples such as competition, free trade, as long as a people's behavior does not hurt others, so he is free. Otherwise, the society can punish them by law or public opinion and restrict their freedom. So the Mill's harm principle is not out of date today, and it provides a guiding ideology for China's current legal construction to properly handle the relationship between individual freedom and society, law and morality. Freedom is most vulnerable, but freedom is not unlimited. Individual freedom must be exercised in the appropriate field, cannot harm to the interests of others, the society, and the country. Then there are some questions we want to discuss with the classmates when after listening to our presentation. Then there is our end of presentation, and thank you for your watching.